the quiet of morning, she scattered nails across Big Shaq's driveway, thinking no one would notice, no one would dare respond. But she didn't expect what came next. No anger, no shouting, just Big Shaq stepping out with calm, quiet resolve and a plan that would turn the entire neighborhood on its head. She wanted to send a message. Instead, she triggered a moment no one would forget. Because when Big Shaq responds, it's never small. It's a statement. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Morning light slid through pristine maple branches, painting Big Shaq's suburban retreat in a quiet gold. After decades under stadium lights and roaring crowds, Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq to the world, now found solace in soft routines, sipping lukewarm coffee on his porch, greeting neighbors with genuine smiles, helping locals at the community center. His presence commanded respect not through athletic dominance, this time, but empathetic warmth. He was generous to a fault, always supplying new books to children, repairing a broken fence on Elm Street, or surprising families with gas card gifts. His wife Shawnee adored him for it, their bond strengthened by shared dreams and mutual humility. To onlookers, his life had become the epitome of American fulfillment, suburban bliss, charitable work, and a loving family. He cherished this quiet as he tended to his rose garden, each bloom carefully pruned. He contemplated the journey that led here, from urban courts to arenas, from championship victories to this unassuming freedom. Lucille, his mother, watched over him often, doting and proud. She had long ago instilled in him the values shaping this new life: kindness, perseverance, and quiet strength. Their shared laughter on weekend mornings was the anchor of his day. But subtle fissures marred the surface. In the stillness, Big Shaq sensed shifts in energy, blades of unease weaving through the suburbs. It began with 2 stray nails found on the driveway's edge, almost inconsequential, easily dismissed. Shaq swept them aside, attributing them to construction at a neighbor's home. But the next day, as he mowed the yard, his hand trembled ever so slightly, upon uncovering another nail, this one closer to the front door. He paused, heart nodding, not out of fear but uncertainty. What if someone meant him harm? He scanned the quiet street. Tidy lawns, white picket fences, children's laughter in the distance. Nothing appeared amiss. A few cars passed, occupants offering waves, never a second glance. Still, he sensed tension, just out of sight. Shawnee arrived, carrying a tray of iced tea. She noticed the brow he couldn't release. He forced a reassuring smile, refilling glasses, and promising nothing was wrong. To her he explained it as suburban debris, but something in her eyes deepened. She squeezed his hand, unspoken concern tracing lines between them. Their routine resumed. Shaq stopped by the local youth center, where at-risk teens gathered. He offered encouragement, shared stories from his rise, urging them not to let adversity define them. His warmth created a ripple. Confidence blossomed in young eyes. The center's director, Evelyn Hayes, applauded his involvement. His presence here had become a cornerstone. The community recognized him as more than a celebrity, a pillar. Yet the sense of disquiet spiraled. One afternoon, collecting the mail, he noticed fresh scratches along his car's bumper, not enough to impair, but deliberate. He assessed the marks: coarse, purposeful. Someone wanted to send a message. Maybe it was random, maybe directed, but beneath his calm exterior, concern coiled. That evening, he mentioned it to Lucille. She, ever perceptive, fixed him with steady eyes. "We don't let this fester," she said, firm but kind. "We observe." Shaquille stood silent, thoughts tumbling. He saw the neighborhood as his sanctuary, not a battleground. Yet the scratches whispered otherwise. He was different here. The first whisper of tension came in polite smiles that never warmed to handshakes. Grocery conversations fell short. Small talk crashed on invisible barriers. He served meals at the soup kitchen. Everyone welcome. But some volunteers cast curious glances, rare smiles that didn't reach their eyes. He asked himself if privilege blinded him to something larger. Over the next few days, he maintained his charity, his porch routines, his evening prayers with Lucille and Shawnee. He gripped his faith that goodness would outshine negativity. He resisted agitation when the mail slot showed dents, or when a stray nail wedged in his lawnmower's blade. Those incidents rattled him, certainly, but didn't break his resolve. Still, Doubt seeped. How far would this escalate? Then came the morning of the neighborhood block party, an event he planned to host, inviting everyone. Colorful banners fluttered overhead, barbecue smoke curled into summer air, children raced through sprinklers while neighbors mingled. Shawnee glided through the crowd, ensuring guests felt welcomed. Lucille shared her sweet potato pies and laughter. Shaq played friendly host, handshakes, casual jokes, genuine interest. Yet even here, the unease crept in. Colleen Marlowe, the new neighbor, hovered at the edges. Pale blue eyes flicked over Shaq with something akin to distaste. She offered an ice cream cone, with stiff artificial sweetness, then drifted away. Shaq sensed her presence as an ember in his festivities. Quiet, watchful, unresolved. He remembered her soft greeting at the fence. When they moved in, she represented typical civility. It shouldn't trouble him. But underneath, there felt discord in her tone, a hidden tension. That night, after guests left and lights dimmed, Shaq walked the driveway. The air tasted of humidity and distant laughter. He planted his flashlight on the cracks in the pavement. There, arranged in a semicircle near the garage, was a new cluster of nails. Long, sharp, malicious. Angry impulse rose, but he pressed it down. No reaction, he told himself. Strength lay in restraint. He flicked on the camera system he had installed last month. Nothing illegal, just precaution. Footage flashed. Empty street, shadows drifting. Colleen's house sat dark across the way. He replayed the night, eyes darting. No clear culprit. He felt exposed and vulnerable in a place he considered home. In silence, he walked back into the house, finding Lucille and Shawnee awake. Without exclaiming, he held the tray of nails before their eyes. They gasped, not at the threat, but the intent behind it. They sat on the couch. Lucille took his hand. "We stand with grace," she whispered. "But we watch. We gather every piece of this puzzle, and we stay strong." Shawnee nodded, tears glinting. The walls of their haven had cracked, but within the fracture blossomed determination. Shaq lay awake beyond midnight, mind turning possibilities. Was Colleen behind this? Someone else? He remembered her thin-lipped smile, her restrained voice. He thought of her council meetings and newspaper mentions. A hint of a pattern grew in his mind. But his resolve, tempered by kindness, solidified. He would uncover the truth, not through aggression, but through revelation and empathy. He would not let malice define his response. Peace had weight, sometimes heavier than conflict, and as morning approached he realized, to preserve peace, sometimes one must face the darkness directly, with clarity, purpose, and unwavering compassion. The sun rose gently over Harbor Oak Drive, casting golden halos across manicured lawns and flowerbed borders. Morning dew clung to petals as the neighborhood stirred to life. Dog walkers, joggers, sprinklers sighing. Shaquille O'Neal stepped outside in slippers, mug in hand, his presence still a beacon of calm and power. He was used to eyes following him, not for fame now, but for the dignified ease with which he navigated the quiet post-fame life. He had found peace here, or so he believed. He strolled toward the mailbox, his frame casting a long shadow over the driveway. As he bent down to retrieve a package, a glint caught his eye. 3 nails, rusty and angled just so, lay scattered near the rear tire of his Escalade. At first he frowned, not out of alarm, but confusion. Maybe a careless passerby. Construction? Kids being reckless? He pocketed them without a word, and moved on, brushing it off with the kind of grace he'd mastered over decades in the public eye. Still, his mind ticked over it longer than it should have. By the time he reached the porch, his instincts had shifted from annoyance to contemplation. He was no stranger to subtle hostility. He had navigated locker rooms, corporate boardrooms, and inner city. He had developed an internal compass, one that quietly pinged when something wasn't quite right. This wasn't loud or violent. It was too clean, too precise. But he refused to entertain paranoia, not yet. Later that afternoon, while organizing canned goods for the church pantry, he mentioned the nails to Lucille. She arched an eyebrow. "Wasn't there a whole box in the garage?" she asked. "Not those kind," he replied, thoughtful. "These were old, real old, like they'd been waiting somewhere." Lucille didn't push further, but her gaze lingered a second longer than usual. That same evening, as dusk settled like a velvet curtain, Shaq noticed her again. Colleen Marlowe, his neighbor 2 doors down. She was pruning her bushes with mechanical precision, white gloves, and a sleeveless denim vest. Her blonde bob never moved out of place, and her smile when offered was as controlled as her shears. She waved at him, not with warmth, but with obligation. He waved back, polite, but measured. Colleen had always seemed contained, not unfriendly, but curated. Her words clipped, her posture straight, her visits brief. When she'd first moved in, she'd brought over a welcome basket with frozen cookies and a stiff bottle of Pinot Grigio. She had complimented Shawnee's rose garden with robotic enthusiasm and asked Shaq if he missed the famed circus. It wasn't what she said, but how she said it, like she was performing niceness for the sake of social protocol. Shawnee had called it Stepford suburbia. Shaq observed her for a moment longer, before retreating inside. Colleen's life was wrapped in symmetry, flag in the yard, 3 potted plants exactly aligned, her chihuahua barking like a metronome, each morning. But symmetry could also mask cracks. The next day brought more nails, 5 this time, jagged hidden among fallen leaves near the passenger side of his vehicle. Shaq's expression didn't shift, but the breath he exhaled was heavier. He gathered them like before, carried them to the garage, and dropped them into a coffee tin. He wasn't planning anything yet, but he needed a record, something tangible. Still, he said nothing to Shawnee. No need to inject worry if it could still be nothing. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in dusty lavender, Shaq sat on the porch again, this time with a small notebook. He jotted the time and date. A car drove by slowly, pausing slightly in front of Colleen's house. A curtain moved. Her light flicked off. He thought back to the block party. Colleen had stayed only 10 minutes, sipping half a glass of wine before retreating. When Shaq had asked if she'd like to try Lucille's pie, she had smiled tight and replied, "I don't usually go for Southern flavors." He had chuckled at the time, brushing it off. But now the comment slithered back with new weight. Her tone had been patronizing, not playful, coded. He recalled another moment. A few weeks ago, he'd been walking a group of young boys from the youth center down the street for a weekend mentorship session. They were loud, laughing, throwing a basketball between them. Colleen had watched them from her porch, unmoving. No wave, no smile, just watching, eyes cold and disapproving. The memory stuck. 2 mornings later, Shawnee called from the garage. Her voice was tight. Shaq stepped out to find another scattering. This time just 1 nail. Clean silver, placed directly beneath the driver's side rear tire. It was no longer possible to believe it was chance. This was deliberate. He looked around empty street. Sprinklers chattering. Colleen's window curtain moved slightly, then stilled. Lucille, appearing beside him, held up the nail and studied it like a relic. "This is how they used to do it," she said. "Back when they wanted you gone but didn't want the blood on their hands." Her words echoed. Shaq stared at the house across the street, feeling that slow, deliberate hum of confrontation beginning. Still, no rage, no shouting. That wasn't his way. He was raised on resolve, not retaliation. But he wouldn't ignore this either. He walked back into the house and installed a discreet motion camera above the garage. Just precaution, not escalation. The neighborhood remained outwardly pleasant. Children played, dogs barked, mailboxes clinked open and closed. Yet beneath it, a current of something rotten pulsed. Shaq saw it now in side glances, in the way one neighbor's greeting had shortened, or how the HOA's latest newsletter mentioned property maintenance concerns in ambiguous tones. He'd lived long enough to recognize indirect speech. These weren't just isolated acts. This was a climate being shaped. Colleen's role wasn't loud or cartoonish. She wasn't a villain out of a protest sign. She was something more common, and far more dangerous. The quiet gatekeeper of exclusion. The kind who didn't need to shout slurs to let you know you didn't belong. Shaq didn't tell the media. He didn't go to the police. Not yet. He needed to understand the shape of this threat before naming it. Instead, he doubled down on visibility, hosting a book drive, coaching a free clinic, donating to the local library's inclusion program. His way of pushing back wasn't through confrontation but presence. If someone wanted to unnerve him, they would have to reckon with just how visible he could become when threatened. But he also knew this wasn't over. The nails weren't random. They were a message. The question now was who else was listening. And as the days grew warmer, the driveway cleaner, and the silence heavier, Big Shaq prepared, not for a brawl, but for exposure. Not to fight fire with fire, but to pull the curtain wide and let the world see what was trying to hide in the shadows of a quiet American dream. Harbor Oak had a rhythm, a carefully curated cadence that gave the illusion of harmony. There were no sirens here, no graffiti-stained walls or blaring music. The lawns were trimmed like military formations, the mailboxes freshly painted, and the laughter of children floated gently like background music in a feel-good commercial. At the heart of it, Shaquille O'Neal walked like a monument of calm, steadfast, familiar, towering not just in size but in soul. He had become something of a legend to the kids. Every afternoon a trail of bicycles would skid to a stop outside his house, eager faces pressed against the fence as he emerged. He had nicknames for each of them. Junior for the freckled redhead who loved baseball, Professor for the curly-haired girl who always carried a notebook. He built basketball hoops at the park, funded the robotics team at the local school, even arranged for a mural project in the underpass with teens from the center. His presence radiated something Harbor Oak hadn't had before, real warmth, unmanufactured. Adults followed too, if more cautiously. Jack Monroe from 2 streets over asked for investment tips. Karen Stafford, who ran the PTA, asked if he'd speak at the school assembly. At church, elders nodded to him with subtle reverence. People invited him to fundraisers, neighborhood cleanups, and barbecues. They loved having a celebrity, especially one like Shaq, who didn't act like one. But love in Harbor Oak wasn't always unconditional. It was contingent, contained. The cracks showed first in whispers. One morning, Shaq rolled his trash bin to the curb like everyone else. But as the week wore on, he noticed his bin was consistently the last to be emptied. The garbage truck lingered at the end of the block, bypassed his driveway, then circled back only when no one else was left. It was subtle, but not unnoticeable. Another time, his recycling wasn't picked up at all. He checked with neighbors. Probably a rot mistake, they shrugged. But their voices carried an edge, too quick, too clipped. He found chalk scribbles near his sidewalk, phrases like "no free passes" and "stay grounded." At first he thought kids were just being expressive, until it became clear the words weren't random. They were messages, veiled and mild, but pointed. At the hardware store, a clerk who once offered discounts suddenly became curt. At the cafe, his usual table by the window was reserved every time he walked in. When he smiled and greeted people he had known for months, some of them hesitated before smiling back. The change was microscopic, but it accumulated. He had become a subject of polite scrutiny. Shawnee noticed too. One evening, as she flipped through local newsletters, she frowned. "They're doing another audit for community aesthetics," she muttered. Guess whose garden didn't meet the seasonal consistency standard? She turned the pamphlet toward him. Their home had been circled in red, the only one flagged. It was all so perfectly orchestrated. No slurs, no shouting, no direct complaint. Just a carefully drawn map of exclusion, executed in paperwork, tone, and process. Passive resistance disguised as protocol. And then there was Colleen Marlowe. She had stopped waving entirely. Shaq would catch her watching from behind her curtains, always watching. Her dog barked more aggressively when he passed. When their driveways overlapped for garbage day, she began wheeling her bins back the second his hit the curb, as if his presence contaminated her routines. She never said a word, never filed a complaint. She didn't need to. One Sunday afternoon, Shaq attended a community potluck. He brought Lucille's famous mac and cheese, and a cooler of drinks. Kids swarmed him for stories. Parents snapped pictures. But in the corner of the yard, Colleen stood with a glass of wine, surrounded by a group of HOA members. Her voice was low, but her eyes never left him. When he approached with a friendly nod, the group thinned. Her smile was razor thin. "Glad you could join," she said flatly, before walking away. That same week, Shaq received a notice from the HOA about an inappropriate accessory structure. It referred to the small wooden bench he had placed under the oak tree, where kids sat for story hour every Saturday. It was suddenly a violation. He didn't react, didn't remove it. Instead, he invited the neighborhood kids for an extra long story session that weekend. Parents dropped them off, some a little more reluctant now. Whispers had started. "He's too involved. He's trying too hard. Makes everything about him." The kind of comments that don't appear on paper, but live in glances and subtext. Lucille noticed the growing tension. She had lived long enough to recognize coded behavior. "They want you grateful," she said one night. "Grateful, quiet, and invisible. You're too tall to be invisible." Shaq nodded. absorbing her words. He had thought his sincerity would be enough. He had thought kindness couldn't be twisted. But the smiles in Harbor Oak were like mirrors, reflective, clean and hollow. There was an undercurrent in this suburb, a fear disguised as formality, a resistance dressed in etiquette. And yet he refused to retreat. Instead, he became more visible. He doubled his efforts at the community center. He wrote articles in the town paper about neighborhood unity and featured others doing good work. He didn't center himself. He lifted others. It didn't erase the resistance, but it softened it in places. Still, Colleen remained unflinching. One Tuesday, he found a printed note on his porch. Keep your influence where it belongs. No signature, just typed words on a single sheet. He stared at it for a long time. The message quiet but loaded. He didn't show it to Shawnee. She was already tense. He did, however, add more memory to the motion cameras. That night, he watched footage. A figure, female, in a hoodie, moved briskly across his lawn at 2:17 a.m. She never looked up, never hesitated. But something in the gait, the posture, the angles, it all pointed in one direction. Colleen. Still, there was no proof. Not enough for the law, but enough for resolve. Shaq began tracking it all. Every chalk mark, every misplaced nail, every coded newsletter. He wasn't just collecting data. He was preparing a map. A map of subtle oppression in its most polished form. He would not react in anger. He would not play into the script written for him. He would expose it, not through confrontation, but through consistency, through grace, through truth. And somewhere beneath the suburb's smile, he knew the moment of reckoning was coming. And when it did, it wouldn't be loud or chaotic. It would be undeniable. The morning arrived quietly, with a soft breeze rolling in from the west, nudging leaves along the curb, and carrying the scent of cut grass. It was a Sunday, slow, sacred, predictable. Lucille O'Neill had come over the night before, insisting she'd stay the weekend, keep Shaq company. She always claimed it was to help tidy up. But Shaq knew better. She was watching over him, not with eyes full of worry, but with the kind of maternal radar that sensed unease in her son's silences, in the furrow of his brow, in the way he lingered too long at the window before speaking. Shawnee had left early for a church board meeting, and Lucille, apron already tied around her waist, had insisted on making breakfast. "I'm still the boss in the kitchen," she said, her laughter light and seasoned, grounding the home with familiarity. Shaq leaned in the doorway, sipping coffee, and watching her flip pancakes, the rhythm of her movement so routine it settled the storm brewing in his chest. He hadn't told her everything. Not yet. The nails, the chalked messages, the HOA citations. He knew she suspected something, but he spared her the details. He didn't want to taint her peace, but this morning would change that. Lucille, humming an old gospel tune, stepped out to toss the compost in the bin by the side of the house. Shaq, distracted by a call from the youth center, didn't follow. He didn't hear the slip, just the sharp intake of breath, the panicked shuffle of feet, and the sudden clatter of the compost lid crashing to the ground. He rushed out, heart pounding. Lucille stood, bracing herself against the trash bin, one hand gripping the railing of the porch step. At her feet, scattered across the bottom landing of the driveway, was a sprawl of broken glass, shards, jagged and pointed, not from a dropped bottle, but something premeditated. They were arranged without pattern, but with enough density that her fall would have been inevitable had she taken one more step forward. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned. She looked at Shaq, lips pressed into a thin line, and simply said, "It's started again, hasn't it?" He said nothing, just exhaled slowly, then moved to sweep the shards into a dustpan. Each scrape of the broom across the pavement sent a chill through him. There was no way this had happened by accident. The sidewalk had been clear the night before. He'd walked it, and now a nest of glass poised like teeth. Lucille went back inside silently. When Shaq followed, he found her wiping the counter with unnecessary force. "You need to confront this," she said finally, her voice low but stern. "They're escalating." "I know," he replied, "but I won't give them what they want." She turned to face him fully now, eyes narrowing. "And what do you think they want? For me to break? Snap?" "Act out," he answered, voice even but tight. "They want me angry, loud, something they can use to justify the whispers." Lucille's silence spoke volumes. She didn't disagree. She simply feared that even his silence might not protect him much longer. That afternoon, Shaq installed another camera, this one hidden behind the house, angled to catch the sidewalk from the side yard to the porch. He didn't say much while doing it. His movements were methodical, his breath steady, but inside his patience was thinning. The streets remained quiet. Children played, neighbors trimmed hedges. Colleen Marlowe watered her petunias, never once looking in his direction. Her yard was perfect, untouched by any trace of disorder. But Shaq noticed a footprint near his trash bin, small, deliberate, facing inward. It hadn't rained in days, yet there was a smear of dirt where none should be. Too faint for proof, but not too faint for suspicion. He began to document everything. Not with outrage, but with focus. He built a folder on his desktop, timestamps, camera stills, HOA letters, screenshots of community chat threads. It was quiet work, gathering, observing, cataloging. Every entry was another thread in a web that hadn't yet revealed its full shape. He didn't stop his routines. He attended mentorship nights, coached the after-school league, even helped organize the Memorial Day cookout. But his smiles were now measured, his eyes always scanning. He could feel the change, not just in others, but in himself. Where warmth had once lived effortlessly, there was now a protective layer, a second skin forming from repeated slights. He didn't tell Shawnee about the glass either. Not yet. Her stress had been mounting with her own community board battles. He watched her sleep that night, her brow twitching faintly as if even her dreams couldn't find rest. He'd protect her peace for as long as he could. But his resolve was starting to shift. He no longer questioned if someone was trying to push him out. Now he was asking how far they were willing to go. 3 days later, another HOA notice arrived. This time, it claimed safety violations due to improper lighting near his driveway. The lights had been there for years. Solar-powered, dim by design, installed for aesthetics. But now, they were a hazard. He took a photo of the notice, added it to the folder, and marked it with the date. The pattern was sharpening. Then came the call from Evelyn, at the youth center. One of the parents had lodged a concern, anonymous of course, about Shaq overstepping boundaries with the children. No incidents, no complaints from the kids themselves, just a general discomfort. Evelyn apologized profusely. She knew it was false, but said she had to document it. Shaq sat alone after the call, staring at his hands. They were the same hands that had lifted trophies, signed scholarships, built shelves at the local shelter, planted trees. Now those same hands were being painted with suspicion, shadowed by someone else's fear. He returned to the footage from the morning of the glass. He slowed it, frame by frame, and there, at 3:04 a.m., a faint silhouette slipped into view from the far corner, hood up, moving with precision. They knelt near the porch, then backed away. The figure's height, gait, a cautious glance toward Colleen's yard. It wasn't enough for a charge, but it was enough for truth. He saved the clip and labeled it Visitor May 14th. Lucille noticed the change in him. "You're not just reacting anymore," she said over coffee. "You're preparing." Shaq nodded. Not for revenge, for exposure. The driveway was clean. The next day, no glass, no nails, just sunlight and silence. But the weight in the air was heavier, like the suburb was holding its breath. And Shaq, patient, steady, watchful, was ready for what came next. Not with fists, but with facts. Shaq had always known that truth didn't shout. It whispered. It crept between doors left ajar, hid behind tight smiles, and disguised itself in handshakes that lingered just a second too long. He also knew that sometimes, to find the truth you had to start closer than was comfortable. And for him, the search began behind a pristine white picket fence 2 doors down. Colleen Marlowe's house was the embodiment of Harbor Oak perfection. Ivy curled evenly along her trellis, ceramic pots displayed in symmetrical order, her porch spotless, but beauty, Shaq had learned, often camouflaged something colder, something deliberate, and Colleen's veneer had long stopped convincing him. He began his quiet digging the only way he knew how, by listening. It started innocently. He visited the town library under the guise of preparing a local history presentation for the youth center. He asked the archivist, an older woman named Marilyn, about prior council members and civic board leaders. Marilyn, who still remembered Shaq's first donation to the children's wing, smiled and obliged. He found Colleen's name quickly. Colleen Marlowe, elected to the City Council of Kingsport County in 2009, served 2 terms. Stepped down in 2017, Officially, she had cited family priorities. But the minutes from those years told a subtler story. Her proposals, though phrased diplomatically, painted a pattern. There was a push to rezone low-income housing to preserve neighborhood identity. She championed school boundary shifts that siphoned minority students into overcrowded districts. She led a campaign against the installation of a cultural arts center downtown, stating it would disrupt the town's character. None of it was outright, never a slur, never a scandal, but the undercurrent was undeniable. She crafted policies with a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Racism masked as regulation. Shaq stared at the ink on the page, his knuckles whitening as he turned each record. It wasn't what she'd done alone. It was how many had let her. The votes passed. The meetings applauded. He could almost hear the claps behind the sanitized language. At dinner, he told Shawnee. He unfolded the documents across the dining table, expecting shock or anger. Instead, Shawnee just sighed, quietly, as if something inside her had been confirmed. I looked her up too, she said. Months ago, before all this started. Shaq's brows furrowed. Why didn't you say anything? Because I didn't want to believe it mattered, she replied, voice soft but firm. I wanted to believe Harbor Oak was better than that she'd moved on, that we were imagining it. Shaq leaned back, absorbing the weight of her restraint. It was one thing to uncover a history. It was another to know it, and try to hope through it. Shawnee continued. But now, I see it. In the notes. In the way people have started pulling back. She's not just part of the problem, Shaq. She is the blueprint. From that night on, his research intensified. He didn't just read. He connected. He spoke to former activists from Colleen's city district, sent quiet emails to civil rights attorneys who had flagged her initiatives back then. One, a woman named Deidre Massey, remembered Colleen well. We used to call her the Duchess of Doubt, she said on the phone. She never said no to Black progress. She just said not now, not here, or not this way. Every document, every story painted the same figure. Colleen Marlowe, the master of coded exclusion, admired for her grace, feared for her subtlety. But Shaq's quiet probing didn't stay quiet for long. He began noticing gaps in his social calendar. Community event invitations that never reached him. A charity banquet that somehow moved venues without notice. The local paper, which once asked him to write monthly columns, informed him that they were restructuring contributors. Small shifts, but they piled up. Harbor Oak was shrinking around him. Then came the coffee shop moment. Shaq walked into Haven Brew, the neighborhood's favorite gathering spot. The barista, always cheerful, gave him a polite nod, but didn't take his order. Instead, she pointed to a laminated sign taped to the counter. No cell phone calls allowed. No political discussions on premises. He wasn't on the phone. He hadn't said a word. But the message was clear. The owner, a man who once asked him for autographs, stood at the back of the counter, avoiding eye contact. He left without a word. That night, Shawnee said what had been simmering between them for weeks. This town is built to keep things looking right, not being right. Lucille, who had joined them for dinner again, folded her arms. You peel back one layer of comfort, and they panic. They don't want a deal. They want to dismiss. Shaq stared out the window at Colleen's porch, empty, but glowing under perfect lighting. He had proof now, but proof wasn't always enough. In places like this, tone mattered more than truth. Still, he kept going. He dug up a podcast Colleen had once appeared on. It was buried deep in a local blog from 2014, a town hall recording. Her voice filled the room, smooth, calculated, measured. We must be mindful of how we preserve Harbor Oak's traditions. Rapid demographic shifts often create cultural dissonance. At the time, the line probably felt innocuous. Today it screamed intent. He clipped it, saved it, filed it away. But not everyone supported his pursuit. Marcus Bright, the head of the local business committee, and one of Shaq's earliest allies, pulled him aside after a community cleanup. Look, he said, glancing around nervously, I know you're right, but you should think carefully about pushing this. Harbor Oak doesn't like waves. Colleen's got roots here. Influence. Shaq's eyes narrowed. So we pretend? Marcus hesitated. We survive. Shaq walked away without answering. He'd never been one to shrink. Still, the resistance wasn't just external. He felt the burden on his own shoulders. The balance of being firm without being framed, of exposing without inciting. But something in him had shifted. He wasn't just defending his home anymore. He was fighting for what was hidden beneath every white picket fence in this country. The history people choose to forget, and the harm they pretend never existed. That week, the glass shards returned. Not many, just 3, placed directly in the corner of the porch beside the welcome mat. Not a hazard, just a reminder. Shaq didn't touch them. He photographed them, logged the time, and slid the images into a new file on his desktop labeled Colleen's footprint. He wasn't seeking vengeance. He was building a mirror, one that would force Harbor Oak to look at itself, and finally see what had always been there. And as the wind rustled Colleen's curtains that night, just briefly, Shaq smiled for the first time in weeks. Because the mask was beginning to slip. And soon everyone would see what lived behind the fence. The subtle attacks had become a rhythm. Predictable, patient, strategic. Shaq had always known conflict. He'd felt it on the court, in negotiations, in the weight of expectations. But what unfolded now, on Harbor Oak, was different. This was a war without fire, an unseen battlefield, where smiles masked strategy, and silence carried accusation. It started with a letter, tucked into his mailbox, no stamp, no return address, just crisp paper, folded in 3. The typeface was formal, the language sterile. Your residence has been flagged for repeated violations of HOA guidelines, including unsanctioned structures and non-compliant decorative elements. It listed the bench beneath the oak tree, the solar lighting by the garage, even the mailbox flag, red instead of the standard black. Shaq stood there, eyes scanning each line. He knew the game now. This wasn't random enforcement. This was targeted bureaucracy. He folded the letter slowly, walked back inside, and filed it next to the others. The folder on his desktop labeled Pressure Tactics was growing heavier. Shawnee looked up as he entered. Another one? He nodded. Now it's the mailbox. She exhaled. They're looking for cracks. Shaq didn't respond. He walked to the kitchen, refilled his water, and stared out the window. Across the street, Colleen Marlowe was watering her hedges. Her movements were deliberate, perfectly timed to catch his gaze. She didn't wave. She didn't smirk. She just paused, eyes flat, as if acknowledging his presence was the only power she needed. The next day brought another inspection. A clipboard-wielding man from the HOA walked Shaq's property perimeter without greeting, jotting notes as if auditing a hostile takeover. When Shaq stepped outside and offered a calm good morning, the man gave only a nod. Politeness, stripped of warmth. By evening, the HOA board issued a second notice, demanding the immediate removal of a wind chime. Lucille had hung months ago. Excessive noise. Shaq had to laugh. The chime barely whispered when the wind passed. But this wasn't about sound, it was about message control. Shaq didn't argue. He took the chime down, held it in his hands for a long moment, then placed it inside, not as surrender, but as strategy. He wasn't going to give them anything reactive. He was playing a longer game. He started logging everything in detail. Times, faces, tones of voice. He installed another camera, this one embedded in the porch lamp. Not for show, for proof. Then he went further. He quietly hired a digital investigator, a professional who specialized in public record analysis. Within a week, he received a report. It confirmed what he already suspected. Colleen Marlowe had been quietly pushing HOA amendments. Her language was coded: standardization, cultural integrity, preservation of aesthetic values. But the intent was clear. Every clause tightened the noose around inclusion. She had slowly molded Harbor Oak into a canvas where she controlled the palette. Still, Shaq kept his posture calm. He attended meetings. He nodded, volunteered, baked pies for the silent auction. But behind that easy demeanor, he was studying the board, learning how decisions were made, watching alliances form and crack. And then, a break. Evelyn Hayes called. One of the board members, Diana Roswell. She's not on Colleen's side. She's uncomfortable with what's happening. I think she'd talk to you, off record. Shaq agreed to meet Diana at the community garden the next afternoon. She arrived late, sunglasses perched low, anxiety written in every movement. I shouldn't even be doing this, she whispered, but I can't watch it continue. She shared how Colleen had recently hosted a private planning dinner inviting only certain board members. She said things like, "We need to restore balance, and he's shifting the energy of the neighborhood too fast." It was all dressed up, but the meaning wasn't hard to decode. Shaq nodded. Did anyone object? Diana looked away. They stayed quiet. That's how it works here. Silence is the currency. He thanked her and didn't press further. He could see the fear in her eyes, fear of social exile, of being next. But the conversation gave him clarity. He wasn't just a target, he was a symbol. And Colleen? She wasn't trying to remove him. She was trying to discredit the idea of him, of black excellence living unapologetically in her curated world. And that realization changed everything. With Diana's words echoing in his mind, Shaq pivoted from defense to offense, not through confrontation, but through calculated transparency. His approach wasn't to expose Colleen through accusation. It was to illuminate her intentions with light, so bright even the shadows couldn't hide. He began curating a quiet arsenal, images of HOA letters, photos of meticulously maintained property now deemed non-compliant, surveillance footage, and most importantly audio clips from Diana's reluctant confession. He layered each item into a digital dossier, organizing it by themes, microaggressions, policy manipulation, social fractures. The folder title read, Harbor Oak, a case study in respectable resistance. But Shaq wasn't building a case for law enforcement. He was building one for public conscience. And the stage he had in mind was larger than Harbor Oak. He reached out to a local documentary filmmaker he had once supported through a youth grant. A woman named Celeste Nolan, known for her work on systemic bias in education and community policing. She remembered him instantly, admired his courage. When he explained the situation, she didn't hesitate. You're talking about coded racism wrapped in community protocol, she said. This could be more than a short doc. It's a conversation starter. Shaq agreed to give her access to the footage and reports. The only condition, no drama, no manipulation, just facts. Truth in sequence, with dignity. As the editing process began, Shaq continued attending community meetings. He spoke with poise, even as Colleen's eyes burned across the room. She no longer addressed him directly. She worked through proxies now. Neighbors who suddenly found their voices about declining neighborhood standards or unusual traffic near his home. Her tactics had grown more desperate, more revealing. Then came the tipping point. A new HOA bulletin was distributed. Unlike the usual printed flyers, this one was glossy, professionally designed, clearly funded. It featured side-by-side images of approved and non-compliant yards. Among them, unmistakably, was Shaq's cropped, anonymized, but obvious. The layout highlighted his flower beds, his custom porch railing, even the solar lamp he'd recently replaced. The title, Preserving Harbor Oak's Identity. Shawnee stared at it, jaw tight. They're not even hiding it now. Shaq said nothing. He walked to his office, uploaded the bulletin, and added it to the growing timeline in the film's production folder. The story was telling itself now. Celeste worked fast. Within 10 days she delivered a 7-minute mini-doc. Polite Exclusion, The Silent War in Harbor Oak. It was direct, powerful, and rooted in facts. Footage from cameras showed the early acts. The nails, the glass. Voice clips played Diana's quiet admissions. The bulletin image flashed alongside archived council records, revealing Colleen's past legislative decisions. Her own words looped from the 2014 podcast, We Must Preserve Neighborhood Identity. The film never named her outright. It didn't have to. Shaq watched it alone first, then with Lucille, then Shawnee. None of them spoke during the final frame. A slow pan of the white picket fences, followed by the title card, Respectability Isn't Always Innocent. He released the mini-doc quietly. No social media blast. No public statement. Just a soft upload to the Youth Center's community education portal, where it was framed as a case study in suburban equity. He emailed the link to 5 people. Celeste Evelyn Hayes, Diana, a local teacher who had once voiced quiet support, and Colleen. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric. Within 24 hours, the video was circulating privately among Harbor Oaks residents. By the weekend it had been shared on 3 regional Facebook groups, each thread flooded with comments, some in disbelief, others defensive, but many, perhaps most shaken. Shaq received an email from a woman named Lydia Halberd, a longtime Harbor Oak resident. She wrote, I'm ashamed I never saw it before. Thank you for helping me open my eyes. Another came from a young couple, new to the area, who wrote, We've always felt something was off. We couldn't name it. Now we can. And Colleen? She didn't respond. But her garden remained unwatered that week. Her porch light stayed off. The HOA board, quietly rattled, suspended new enforcement measures. A new community reconciliation committee was proposed by Diana, who now spoke openly about what she had once only whispered. Shaq didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He tended his rose bushes, repaired the youth center's basketball hoop, and took Lucille out for Sunday brunch. His message had never been revenge. It had always been about visibility.
The war wasn't over. Not really. The system didn't unravel with one film, one folder, one week. But it had shifted. Something once invisible had been named. And that, Shaq knew, was the first real victory.
Because when you shine light long enough, even the quietest shadows begin to retreat. Lucille O'Neill had always been a quiet force. A woman of presence, not volume. Where others might raise their voices, she held her ground with silence sharpened by experience. Shaq had learned that from her long before he'd learned to dribble a basketball. And now as they sat together beneath the porch awning while the skies thickened above Harbor Oak, that same silence returned. It wasn't avoidance. It was weight. The kind that carried decades. The video had shaken the neighborhood. Conversations had shifted. Alliances splintered. And the once invisible barrier around Colleen Marlowe's reputation was fracturing. But the most significant shift for Shaq wasn't out there. It was inside. The unraveling had unearthed something deeper, something heavier, and Lucille knew it before he did. She watched him now, his shoulders broader than any man she'd ever known, yet drawn tighter than they had in years. He stared out at the lawn, coffee untouched. His voice, when it finally came, was low. I didn't want it to go this far. Lucille didn't look at him. You didn't take it there. You just stopped pretending it wasn't happening. Shaq said nothing, but his eyes tightened. She took a slow sip of her tea. The wind began to stir, brushing the trees with soft agitation. You think this started with you, she said after a moment. But it didn't. What you're seeing here, we've been dodging versions of it all our lives. He turned to her now. There was no resentment in her tone. Just history. Worn and undeniable. I remember the first time I saw a line drawn around me, she continued. I was 9. We just moved to a neighborhood in Newark. A white woman crossed the street every time I walked by, never said a word. But she made sure I saw her do it. That was her message. You don't belong here, little girl. Shaq leaned forward. You ever confront her? Lucille shook her head. No. But I made sure every time she crossed the street, she had to walk past the neighbors I eventually made friends with. I built a life right in front of her eyes. That was my answer. The rain started. A slow pattering against the porch roof. She continued. When I got older, I saw the smarter ones, the ones who didn't cross the street. They'd smile, offer pie, ask questions about your hair with a compliment. But their votes, their boards, their party invites, they always told you what they really believed. Shaq felt her words settle inside him, anchoring something that had been adrift. The sabotage, the citations, the polite smears, none of it was new. It was just evolved, dressed in suburban comfort. Lucille reached into her purse, pulled out an old photograph. It was faded, the edges soft. 2 young black women in church dresses stood on a dusty sidewalk, one holding a protest sign, the other Lucille smiling just slightly. This was 67, she said. After a grocery store downtown wouldn't let us buy milk unless we ordered through a side window, we didn't scream, we didn't vandalize. We just stood out front, every day for a week, holding signs that said, we pay here too. Shaq stared at the photo. What happened? People honked. Some spat. Some joined. Eventually, the owner opened the front doors to everyone. A silence stretched between them again, but this time it was warm, empowering. You think Harbor Oak is different, she said. It's not. The strategy's just quieter now. Like wind. It doesn't always tear roofs off. Sometimes it just loosens them one nail at a time. Shaq's lips curled in a grim smile. Like the nails in my driveway. Lucille nodded. Exactly. A flash of lightning lit the horizon. The wind now rattled the chimes they'd rehung just that morning. Shaq had insisted they go back up. A small act, but deliberate and defiant. Lucille turned toward him fully, her voice now carrying that firm maternal edge. What you're doing now, it's not just about Colleen. It's about every version of her that thought you wouldn't notice. Or if you did, you wouldn't last. Her eyes narrowed. You are lasting. That's the threat. Shaq leaned back in his chair, absorbing her words like roots drink rain. She had drawn the map. What he faced wasn't new. It was inherited. It wasn't just about protecting his name, or even his community. It was about honoring every sacrifice that let him sit on this porch in this neighborhood and say, "Not this time." "I want them to know," he said finally. "Not just what they did, but what they almost got away with." Lucille smiled. "Then keep showing them. Piece by piece. Without anger. Without apology." Thunder rolled, long and low. And in that storm, mother and son sat united. Not in fear, but in purpose. Because the battle wasn't just his. It had always been hers too. And now, he understood it completely. The sun rose like any other. A calm golden ribbon pulled across Harbor Oak's quiet rooftops. Birds skimmed the trimmed hedges, sprinklers hissed on schedule, and mail trucks rattled predictably down the tree-lined avenues. To the neighborhood, it was an ordinary morning. But for Shaquille O'Neal, it was the day everything would pivot. The culmination of whispers, threats, and warnings was finally taking form, not with a bang, but with a pattern, a signature act, deliberate, unmistakable. He had sensed something the night before. Lucille had stayed longer than usual, her eyes more searching than motherly. Shawnee had left dinner half-eaten, distracted by a sense of unspoken tension in the air. Even the chimes by the porch, recently rehung with quiet defiance, had gone still windless, but not at peace. At 3:26 a.m., the camera in the garage Eve blinked awake. A silhouette emerged from the right side of the frame. Hoodie up, movements quick but cautious, not frantic, methodical. The figure clutched a black satchel, its bottom sagging with weight. With each careful step toward the driveway, a hand dipped into the bag and scattered sharp silver glints along the asphalt like feeding breadcrumbs to pigeons. Nails, dozens of them, thick industrial-grade roofing nails. Too large for a coincidence, too many for a mistake. Shaq watched the playback just after sunrise. The coffee in his hand had gone cold by the time the footage looped back to the beginning. He didn't blink. He didn't exhale. He simply sat still, absorbing not the action, but the intent. The certainty, the boldness of it. There was no longer room for ambiguity. No plausible deniability. No maybe it's just a misunderstanding. This was a message. Final, full volume. He didn't wake Shawnee. He didn't call Lucille. Instead, he went outside, carefully stepping over the metal shards, filming the scene with his phone from multiple angles. He captured the arrangement, the proximity to the tires, the absence of footprints in the gravel beside them. Then he began sweeping, slowly, deliberately, as if erasing evidence not to conceal the crime but to prepare for its exposure. By mid-morning, the footage was uploaded to a private cloud and shared with Celeste Nolan, the documentary filmmaker who had helped craft the first mini-doc weeks earlier. Alongside the video, Shaq sent a message. Final act. Let's make it public. But not just a post. Something live. Something they'll remember. Celeste replied in minutes. We go tonight. Streaming event. I'll coordinate it all. The plan was simple, and it was Shaq's idea. Use the youth center, his sanctuary, as the stage. Frame the event as a digital fundraiser for anti-racism education. No names mentioned. No legal accusations. Just a truth-telling evening backed by footage, stories, and solidarity. The camera would speak. The community would watch. And the facade of Harbor Oak would finally fracture. Not through rage, but revelation. By afternoon, the center buzzed with quiet urgency. Evelyn Hayes worked with the tech crew to rig lighting and sound. Celeste rehearsed the transitions. Teen volunteers helped set up displays of artwork and essays from young residents about inclusion, fairness, and the quiet cruelty of exclusion. Every piece of the night was intentional. Shaq didn't rehearse. He didn't script his words. He walked the perimeter of the building twice, checked the security feed, and stood quietly at the back of the room until the clock struck 7.
Then the stream went live.
Across phones, laptops, and smart TVs, in Harbor Oak and beyond, viewers logged in to what they thought was another community update. What they got instead was a confrontation with silence, and a neighborhood forced to look at itself. The event opened with Evelyn, who spoke about the youth center's mission. Then came clips from the original mini-doc, played with context, visual evidence of Shaq's journey from community helper to targeted resident. Then, slowly, Celeste's narration introduced the new footage. The screen flickered, the dark figure entered, the bag opened, The nails fell. The silence in the youth center room was palpable. The live stream chat exploded. Emojis, comments, questions. Celeste's voice returned. This act was recorded just hours ago. This is not historic. This is now. Then came Shaq. He stepped forward, not angry, not shaken, but resolute. His voice was steady, not because he had rehearsed, but because it was his truth. I didn't move here to be a symbol. I moved here to be a neighbor, a mentor, a man, but some people couldn't see past their own fear of difference. They didn't hurl slurs. They didn't burn crosses. They left nails. They filed citations. They smiled while twisting the rules. This, he gestured to the screen, is not about me alone. It's about a system built to hide its own cruelty behind policy and politeness. But I won't be quiet, and I won't leave. He paused. Because if I do, the next kid who looks like me might think that silence is the only answer. The stream ended not with applause, but reflection. The fundraiser ticker climbed past its goal in under 2 hours. Comments poured in, residents apologizing, promising change, asking how to help. Not everyone was ready to reckon with the truth, but enough were, and that was a start. Colleen didn't speak publicly. Her porch remained dark. Her windows shuttered. But word spread quickly that she had been removed from 2 HOA committees by unanimous vote. Diana Roswell announced the creation of a community ethics board to oversee all future HOA policies, public, inclusive, and filmed. Shaq returned home just before midnight. The nails were gone, but the message remained. In the flood of emails, the support at the youth center, the stillness of Colleen's yard. Shawnee met him at the door, her eyes tired but proud. Lucille was inside, tea in hand, watching the replay on her tablet. Outside, a breeze stirred the chimes. Not loud, just enough to remind the world that something had changed. Because on this day, it hadn't just rained nails. It had rained! Colleen Marlowe's world didn't fall apart in an explosion. It unraveled in whispers, turned shoulders, and doors that closed with the gentlest clicks. No alarms sounded, no cameras chased her through the streets. But in Harbor Oak, where reputation was currency, she found herself suddenly, devastatingly bankrupt. The morning after the live stream, her porch light remained off. The wind chimes that once sang a calculated civility were gone. Her hedges, always pristine, had started to brown at the edges. She did not water them that day, or any day after. Word moved faster than she could control. It wasn't just the footage of the nails, or the quiet symbolism of her absence. It was the realization among neighbors, board members, and even her closest allies that they had played a role, wittingly or not, in something cruel. And now, under the weight of exposure, they were scrambling to reposition themselves. The HOA board held an emergency session. It wasn't advertised. It wasn't discussed in the open chat groups. But by midday, a quiet update appeared on the community portal. Colleen Marlowe has voluntarily stepped down from all HOA responsibilities. Effective immediately. The wording was diplomatic. The decision wasn't. Diana Roswell, now emboldened, issued a secondary statement. It didn't name Colleen directly, but it denounced the misuse of procedural authority to target residents under the guise of neighborhood standards. She referenced the video, acknowledged a pattern of exclusion, and called for a town-wide review of governance practices. Colleen's name didn't need to appear. Everyone understood. By that evening, 2 of her sponsors from the Women's Civic Heritage Guild had removed her profile from their website. Her upcoming guest appearance on a podcast about maintaining community values in urban-adjacent suburbs was quietly canceled. A scheduled panel where she was to speak on homeowner leadership and policy replaced her with a note, "Speaker update pending." In a place where reputation was managed like a garden groomed, styled, always blooming, Colleen had become untouchable. And not because someone had attacked her, because someone had simply shown who she really was. But the silence that came from Shaq made the collapse even more severe. He never named her, never commented on her resignation, never acknowledged the gossip. He walked through Harbor Oak as he always had, steady, present, generous. He still mentored kids at the center, still waved at neighbors, still brought his mother to Sunday brunch. His refusal to gloat became its own headline. Local journalists reached out. He declined. One reporter asked to speak on record about Colleen's exposure and fallout. Shaq's response: "This was never about tearing someone down. It was about building something better. I'm just glad we're starting to have the right conversations." The quote made it to the front page. Compassion, not vengeance, defined his victory. And that, more than the footage or the campaign, is what rewrote the town's story. Still, the fallout for Colleen continued. Former allies avoided her in the market aisles. She stopped attending community gatherings. When her chihuahua barked on morning walks, no one paused to say hello. The more she disappeared from sight, the more people remembered how loud her presence had once been, and how quietly cruel it had become. One morning, Shawnee spotted her near the mailbox hood up, face down. She seemed smaller. Not physically, but spiritually, diminished by her own choices. She looked like she was disappearing. Shawnee told Shaq later. Not from the town, from herself. Shaq nodded, but said nothing. He had no need to confront her. No words could undo what had already been done. The lesson had arrived in the silence. The power she once held, the social gravity, the subtle authority was gone. Not because someone had taken it, because she had hollowed it out from the inside. Lucille, always clear-eyed, offered the final word. People like her never think the truth will outlast the lie. But it does, every time. And so, Harbor Oak changed. Not all at once, not completely, but enough to breathe, enough to grow, and enough to remember. Colleen stayed in her house, but she no longer shaped the neighborhood. The picket fences remained, but now they no longer hid the truth. Time moved differently in Harbor Oak after the storm. Not the kind that tore shingles from rooftops or flooded basements, but the quiet reckoning that peeled away a community's polished veneer. The silence, once a tool for avoidance, had become a space for reflection, and at the center of it all stood Shaquille O'Neal, unshaken, unbroken, and unchanged, except for the weight of clarity he now carried. Colleen Marlowe's house remained, but her presence had evaporated. She wasn't gone, she still lived there, but the air around her porch felt abandoned. The curtains stayed drawn. The mailbox stood untouched for days at a time. No garden clippings, no HOA circulars, no flag draped on her siding. Her world had withdrawn into itself, shrinking with each passing week. What once had been the nucleus of subtle control was now a hollow structure in the middle of a neighborhood trying to learn how to look at itself differently. Shaq didn't walk past her house often, not because he feared her return to relevance, but because he no longer needed to acknowledge the collapse. He understood now that justice wasn't always a spectacle. Sometimes it was just the absence of the lie, the clearing of the stage so the truth could stand unchallenged. It had been 6 weeks since the night of the live stream, and in that time, Harbor Oak had shifted. Not revolutionized, not transformed, but shifted. Conversations once whispered behind hedges were now spoken across fences. Evelyn Hayes had been invited to join the HOA's new advisory subcommittee. Diana Roswell had begun an equity coffee hour at the local rec hall, a space where residents came not to defend themselves but to listen, to learn. And Shaq, never interested in holding a spotlight, returned to building this time, with something permanent in mind. He started clearing the patch of lawn at the base of his driveway, the spot where the nails had fallen, the spot where the messages were first delivered. To many, it might have made sense to pave it, to armor it with stone or fence it off. But Shaq chose to plant. He called it the Peace Garden, not with a plaque or ribbon cutting, but with action. He brought in soil, laid mulch, and with Shawnee and Lucille beside him, placed flowers chosen not just for beauty, but for meaning. Marigolds, for resilience, lavender for calm, daisies for clarity, and beneath each plant, a small card sealed in resin, bearing a word: truth, grace, memory, change. The children came first. They brought painted rocks and notes. One boy left a drawing of a son holding hands with a basketball. Another, a young girl from the youth center, taped her first poem to the base of the rosebush. Even in soil that's cracked, something kind can grow. Neighbors followed, at first cautious, then consistent. They asked how they could help. They offered bulbs from their own gardens. One family brought seedlings from a grandmother's homestead in Georgia. The garden became a slow ceremony, something that didn't erase the past but gave it a place to live without shame. Shaq often stood by it, in the early morning, before the streets filled. It wasn't performative, it was reflection. Every flower was a contradiction to the harm once intended for that ground. And every bloom whispered back, "We are still here." He didn't speak much about Colleen. Not to the press, not to the community, not even to his own family, unless asked. His restraint wasn't born of mercy. It was discipline. He had made a decision long ago, not to become what he was fighting. And now, more than ever, that discipline bore fruit. Lucille called it radical peace, not the absence of conflict, but the refusal to let conflict poison the spirit. People think justice needs a hammer, she told him one day, as they trimmed the garden's edges. Sometimes it needs a seed and a little time. Shaq nodded, wiping soil from his palms. We gave them both. A local journalist eventually wrote a story about the Peace Garden. No dramatic headline, just the simple title, Where the Nails Once Fell. It quoted Shaq once. I didn't build this because I needed to heal. I built it because we all did. The article was shared across local school boards and community platforms. It inspired 3 other neighborhoods to plant similar gardens, each with their own message. In time, Harbor Oak's story became less about Colleen and more about what followed her collapse, the community's slow walk toward better. And in that shift, the final question lingered. Had Colleen changed? No one knew for certain. She never made a public statement, never returned to the board. But 2 months after the garden bloomed, Shaq noticed something new. A planter box had appeared on her front porch, just one. It held 3 small succulents, simple, quiet, alive. He didn't interpret it as redemption, but he didn't see it as rot, either. It was, perhaps, the beginning of reflection, something silent but sincere, and that was enough. The final Sunday of summer arrived warm and golden. The Peace Garden was in full color. Children danced around it, teens from the center led a tour for new neighbors, and Shawnee passed out lemonade under a canvas shade. Shaq stood with Lucille near the oak tree, his eyes surveying the crowd, not for security, but for gratitude. In a world that had tried to frame him as a threat, he had answered with patience. In a place that had tried to contain him, he had built something that couldn't be ignored. No fences, no revenge, just growth. Because in the end he had learned the deepest truth of all. When you choose to grow where hate once tried to plant itself, you don't just reclaim space, you redefine it. And that, he knew, was the real power. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Start the conversation in your neighborhood. Ask what's hiding behind the smiles. Share the silence you once ignored, and amplify the truths that need light. Because change doesn't come from watching. It comes from choosing to see and refusing to look away.